how did you become aware of the human rights situation of migrant workers?
I first became aware of this situation when I went to the Gulf states on business trips with my last job, and I became aware that there were a huge number of Asian migrant workers working on construction sites. I also realized through reading the local newspapers, like every so often you would see a tiny, tiny story about the death or the suicide of a housemaid who was fleeing from maybe an abusive employer. And I was really horrified when I saw these reports and thought, this is absolutely shocking. How can this only be a tiny story like this in the media? So then I started to, do a bit of research and ask some more questions.
And which Gulf states did you come to?
Dubai and Bahrain.
Was there a single incident that inspired you to get involved?
It was more a general sense of shock that both local people and also the large community of Western expat workers seemed quite happy to ignore the fact that abuses of migrant workers were going on construction sites and, in homes all across those countries. And I just felt that people were aware that these abuses were happening, but they were very happy to turn blind eyes to them. And I was really, really appalled at this. Not very much has been written about this issue either for the media, internationally or in the Gulf states themselves, and certainly there hasn't been much academic work on the subject. I think actually matters came to a head when I was in Bahrain on a business trip back in November, and I was just doing some research just for myself to find out a little bit more about migrant rights issues when I came across the migrant rights site which Ezra had set up. So I sent Ezra an email saying, wow, this site is amazing, and I see you're in Bahrain, is there any chance we could meet up, because I'd be really interested to talk to you some more and just find out about the kind of campaigning work and awareness raising work that you're doing. After that, Ezra got me involved in editing and contributing material to the migrant rights site.
Well, before I met you, I was looking so hard to find an editor for the site, and you'll find editors for absolutely any issue in the Middle East except for this one. Everyone wants to get involved in any human rights abuse case, whether it's, Palestine or minority issues, but never anything about migrant rights. So I think, for me, that was my inspiration also. How much do you think is being done on both a regional and international basis to improve the situation of migrant workers right now?
Definitely not enough. I think the problem with migrant workers is in terms of human rights campaigns, in terms of international law. Migrant rights seems to be a bit of a blind spot because there's some debate as to whether they're the responsibility of the governments of the Gulf states or if they're the responsibility of the countries that send them. And the general consensus seems to be that they're the responsibility of no one. So
yeah, it's funny because when you go to an embassy here and you put in a complaint, they say, well, you need to go and talk to the Ministry of Labor or whatever. So when you go there, they will have to say, well, you have to go to the embassy, and they keep sending you back and forth.
The UN over the past year or so have introduced these universal periodic reviews for countries where the country's whole human rights record will be laid open to scrutiny by a board of representatives from member states. And Dubai and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, as far as I'm aware, have had universal periodic reviews. The problem with this is that how the local media have portrayed it is that these human rights reviews have been a thundering success because the UN has praised countries like Bahrain and Dubai on improving things like women's rights, media censorship, children's rights, and that kind of thing. What the media has largely ignored is the fact that I think Dubai especially has ignored recommendations from the UN on its treatment of migrant workers. And as it turns out, treatment of migrant workers was a huge topic of discussion at these meetings for the Universal Periodic Review. But by all accounts, it looks like the UAE has just sort of batted these allegations aside and doesn't seem to want to take any action and refused all of these recommendations from the UN. The authorities seem to be, and companies seem to be very, very unwilling to spend any money on making things better for migrant workers. Mm-hmm. And I think the case that springs to mind is the ban on transporting workers in open trucks in Bahrain. One thing I was really horrified by was like the corporate sector was they were up in arms about it. They said, there's no way that we're going to spend that money, it's going to cost us way too much. And there seems to be this idea that, it's not worth spending money on protecting migrant workers.
Yeah, that's basically their argument. And, what's more astonishing is that even after they make these comments, there's no outrage about it. And migrant workers are voiceless. Who's going to speak on their behalf? Because, they literally have no voice, also because of the language barrier. Most of them don't speak either English or Arabic. So it's hard for people to communicate with them and ask what they want. And it's hard for them to communicate what they want from their employers. What do you think needs to get done in terms of policies for this issue not to be such a grave one?
Companies working in the, especially international companies working in the Gulf states, in the construction sector, need to really look at their policies for protecting workers. And these companies need to start putting human life above profits. However, they're not going to have that much success in improving the position of migrant workers unless they get some support from the government. So I think the governments of these countries need to have more legal recognition for migrant workers, and there needs to be more places for migrant workers to go to if they do run into trouble, because obviously a lot of countries in the Gulf states like Kuwait or Bahrain don't have embassies for all the countries of the migrant workers that work there, so there's nowhere to go. So there needs to be, I think it would be really great if a lot of, Bahrain or Dubai could allow NGOs to actually run shelters and not take such a sort of cynical view of any NGO that attempts to help these people.
I think if this issue was communicated properly in the mainstream, there would be many, many NGOs who would be willing to help. And very few of them actually operate in any way inside the Gulf. I know that local NGOs in both the UAE and Bahrain do try to get involved and try to help by, publishing press releases or condemning things, but that's really as far as they can go, because us local ones, we cannot really take action without us getting into much trouble. So in a way, people are discouraged. What can people do right now?
In terms of especially domestic workers, one thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a greater level of awareness among locals about the rights of migrant workers and the kind of abuses that they're subject to. I think one example of this, which some readers of migrant rights might be aware of, is the Rahma campaign, which was a public awareness campaign aired by a Saudi Arabian advertising agency, which was a public awareness campaign to encourage, to just really make people wake up to the kind of abuses that migrant workers face. Possibly even a willingness of young people to put pressure on the government and on corporations, because ultimately we need their cooperation if the situation is going to get any better.
What can bloggers and people online do to help?
Well, first of all, get blogging, get writing. Have an opinion on it, I think, and write it down, because as we talked about earlier, when migrant rights abuses are reported in the media, it's just a news report, sometimes it's only a couple of lines long. So one thing that bloggers can do is they can fill that gap by really writing reports and really discussing the issues that are involved. The other thing I would say is we have a fantastic tool available to us in Facebook. So I would say to anyone who really cares about migrant rights, get on Facebook and use it as much as you can to spread the word. Post your blog up there, post your post links, post photos, get people talking about it. My final conclusion is that as a first step, we need to just do all we can to make sure that this issue gets out in the open and that it's talked about.
And can you say why? How big is this? Some people may not have an idea. How many people are even involved in these kinds of human rights abuses?
We're talking about millions of people, from all over Asia, the Arab world, sub-Saharan Africa, that come to the Gulf states in their thousands every year to work as domestic maids, to work as construction workers, to work in factories. These people constitute a massive proportion of the population in almost all of the Gulf states, and abuses of these people are taking place on an absolutely massive scale, but from what I can see, these abuses are a taboo issue that nobody wants to talk about. So I think the first thing we can do is just break that silence and get people aware and get people talking.